The sun was a hammer and the land was the anvil. For weeks, the territory of Arizona and New Mexico had been forging Evelyn Hart into something new, something harder and drier than the woman who had left Boston with a trunk full of books and starched collars. The wagon's canvas top offered little more than a suggestion of shade, and the heat baked the air until it shimmered, making the distant mesas dance like ghosts on the horizon. Red dust, fine as powdered sin, coated everything. It was in the creases of her traveling dress, under her fingernails, and at the back of her throat, a constant gritty reminder of where she was. This was not the polite, tamed earth of the East. This was land that fought back, that held its water deep and its secrets closer. And yet, Evelyn had come willingly. She had come to teach the children of the miners in a place called Dry Vale, a name that seemed more like a warning than a destination. She believed education was a lantern, and she intended to light it even here, in a world that seemed determined to exist in shadow. Across from her sat Crawford Pike, a man who seemed immune to the dust and the heat. His suit, though dark, remained crisp, and the polish on his boots still held a defiant gleam. He was a representative of the Transcontinental Rail Company, a fact he had made known to everyone on the wagon train within the first hour of their departure from Santa Fe. He spoke of the future in terms of steel rails and timetables, of towns that would bloom overnight where there was now only sagebrush and rock. He gestured with a clean, uncalloused hand toward the vast emptiness outside. This, Miss Hart, is the future canvas of America. We are simply painting in the details. The railroad is the brush. And once it arrives in Dry Vale, everything will change. There will be order, prosperity. An older woman, Martha, fanning her flushed face with a dusty handkerchief, sighed. Order would be a blessing. I hear the Apache are getting bolder. My cousin wrote that they ran off a whole herd of cattle just last month. Pike nodded gravely, his expression a perfect blend of concern and authority. It is a regrettable situation. A primitive people cannot be expected to understand the tide of progress. They see it as a threat, and like any cornered animal, they lash out. But civilization, like a mighty river, cannot be dammed for long. It will find a way through. Evelyn held her tongue, but her fingers tightened on the leather cover of the book in her lap. A collection of Shakespearean plays. She had read accounts of the Apache, accounts that painted them not as cornered animals, but as a people defending a home they had known for centuries. But saying so here, in this rumbling wagon, to this man who spoke of civilization as if he had invented it, would be useless. It would only solidify the quiet reputation that had followed her west. The prim Boston schoolteacher, the woman a little too fond of her own opinions, the Virin lady who guarded her honor so fiercely it had become a subject of crude speculation among men who had none. The day wore on, a monotonous cycle of jolting wheels and the endless aching sky. Then, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the clouds in shades of blood and rust, the wind picked up. It started as a whisper, a sigh across the plains, but quickly grew into a moaning howl. A wall of red dust, a churning, blinding cloud, rose from the southwest and bore down on them. "Dust storm!" the driver yelled, his voice nearly swallowed by the wind. "Hold on!" The world dissolved into a crimson twilight. The wagon rocked violently, and visibility dropped to nothing. It was in this chaos, this sudden, unnatural night, that the attack began. A gunshot cracked, sharp and close, followed by a chorus of whoops and hollers that sounded more theatrical than terrifying. Figures on horseback emerged from the swirling dust, their faces smeared with garish paint, a few feathers tied haphazardly in their hair. Panic erupted. Martha screamed. The men grabbed for their rifles. Evelyn pressed herself into the corner of the wagon, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. But even in her fear, she was a creature of detail. Her mind, trained to observe and analyze, began to snag on things that felt wrong. One of the attackers who leaped onto the wagon ahead of theirs wore trousers of a coarse blue wool beneath his loincloth. Another, brandishing a rifle, had a clumsiness to his movements, an unfamiliarity with the horse he rode. As one of them galloped past her wagon, yelling a string of what was meant to sound like a native tongue. Evelyn saw the stark white line of a sunburn on his neck, just above the collar of a shirt he was not wearing. And then, the most damning detail of all. In the brief moment, a gust of wind cleared the air. She saw the heel of a rider's boot, a worn, stacked leather heel of the type issued to cavalry soldiers, not the soft sole of a moccasin. Her gaze flickered to Crawford Pike. He had his pistol drawn, but he had not fired it. He was watching the raid with a calm, almost proprietary air, as if he were a director observing a scene he had staged. The chaos was not a threat to him. It was a tool. Then, as quickly as the first attack had begun, a second force entered the fray. They were silent. They moved with a lethal grace that made the first attackers look like clumsy children playing a game, arrows fletched with hawk feathers. Hissed through the dusty air, they struck with unnerving precision, finding shoulders and thighs, disabling the riders and sending their horses into a panic. They were not killing. They were simply and efficiently dismantling the assault. Evelyn peered through a slit in the canvas. She saw a man emerge from the cover of a rock outcropping. He was tall and lean, his body a study in controlled power. He wore no paint, only a simple headband holding back his black hair. His face was stark, carved with a quiet intensity that was more formidable than any painted mask. In his hands he held a bow, but it was his eyes that held her. They were dark, intelligent, and filled with a profound stillness, a deep calm in the heart of the storm he commanded. This was Nantan. She did not know his name, but she knew, with an instinct that went deeper than reason, that he was real. The others had been a performance. He was the truth. His fighters, moving with the same silent discipline, drove the disguised attackers back into the red dust from which they had come. The entire engagement lasted less than 2 minutes. It was not a battle, it was a correction. As the last of the fake warriors vanished, the wind began to die down. The man, the leader, stood for a moment beside the rocks. His gaze swept over the disordered wagon train, a cool, assessing look that missed nothing. For a single, breathless second, his eyes met Evelyn's. There was no threat in his look, no savagery. There was only an acknowledgement, a flicker of understanding that passed between them in the settling dust. Then, he turned and melted back into the landscape, as much a part of the rocks and shadows as the ancient junipers. He and his men were gone, leaving behind only a few groaning, wounded men and the lingering scent of ozone from the discharged rifles. The dust began to settle. The sun, now low on the horizon, cast long, distorted shadows across the scene. Crawford Pike was the first to speak, his voice booming with manufactured outrage. "Apache," he declared, holstering his unfired pistol. "You see, just as I said, they grow bolder by the day. They have no respect for property, for lives, for progress. They tried to slaughter us all." The other men, shaken and rattled, readily agreed, their fear latching onto the easy explanation he provided. They gathered around the wounded attackers, who were now moaning about their injuries in plain, unaccented English. "We drove them off," Pike continued, his voice taking on a heroic tone. "But they will be back. This proves it. We need the railroad. We need the army. We need to bring order to this land once and for all." Evelyn remained silent, her mind racing. She had seen it all. The cavalry boot, the sunburned neck, Pike's strange calm, the efficient, almost surgical intervention of the second group. She knew what had happened. Pike had hired those men to stage an attack, to frighten the settlers, to create a pretext for driving the Apache from the land the railroad so desperately wanted. And the real Apache leader, Nantan, had intervened to stop it. not to harm them. She looked at the faces around her, faces etched with fear and anger, all directed at a phantom enemy. She was the only one who knew the truth, and the knowledge was a cold, heavy stone in her stomach. She was a woman, a stranger, a schoolteacher with a trunk full of books. Who would listen to her against a man like Crawford Pike? The wagon train, battered and subdued, finally rolled into the small, dusty clutch of buildings that was Dry Vale. The town looked tired, as if it had been fighting the sun and wind for too long and was slowly losing. A single saloon spilled yellow light and loud voices onto the main street. As Evelyn stepped down from the wagon, her legs unsteady, she could already hear some of Pike's men inside, their voices raised as they told a grand and bloody tale of the Apache ambush they had so bravely fought off. The lie was already spreading, carried on the evening air along with the dust and the distant, mournful cry of a coyote, far off, so faint it might have been her imagination. Evelyn thought she heard the whistle of a train, a lonely, metallic sound slicing through the vast silence of the desert. It was the sound of the future, she thought, and it was coming for them all, carried on a current of red dust and deception. The schoolhouse was a forgotten shed that smelled of dust and abandoned ambitions. Its single room had been hastily cleared of mining equipment, but the ghosts of pickaxes and shovels remained as dark outlines on the plank walls. Yet, when Evelyn Hart swept the floor and arranged the 3 rough-hewn benches, she saw not a shed, but a sanctuary. Each evening, she filled a small lamp with oil and set it on a hook by the door, and its small, steady flame was a point of light against the vast, encroaching darkness of the high desert. It was a small act of defiance, a promise that here, at least, ignorance would not hold sway. Dry Vale was a town held together by suspicion. Crawford Pike's version of the wagon train attack had become gospel, repeated in the saloon and the general store until it was as solid a fact as the mountains themselves. The Apache were no longer a distant threat. They were a malevolent presence, blamed for every stray calf and every dry well. The whispers grew into a low, constant hum of fear and hatred, a poison that seeped into the very soil of the town. This poison found its most potent voice in the pulpit of the town's only church. Reverend Harlan Briggs was a man whose piety was as starched and severe as his collar. On Sunday, he spoke of civilizing the wilderness, of bringing God's righteous order to a heathen land. His sermons were not about forgiveness or grace, but about strength and dominion. He painted the railroad as an instrument of divine will and the Apache as the servants of chaos, an obstacle to be swept aside by the righteous tide of progress. Evelyn sat in a back pew, the hard wood pressing into her spine, and listened as the word of God was twisted into a weapon. The town's law was a man named Sheriff Amos Cutter. He was a large man, soft in the middle but hard in the eyes, who wore his badge less as a symbol of justice and more as a license for cruelty. He was a frequent and welcome guest at Crawford Pike's table in the saloon, and their shared laughter was a sound that made honest folk lower their voices. Cutter enforced a particular kind of order in Dry Vale, an order where Pike's interests were protected and inconvenient truths were buried. Evelyn found lodging in a small, clean room above the boarding house run by Marisol Ortega. Marisol was a woman of quiet strength and deep compassion, her face a map of worries and smiles. She moved with an unhurried grace, her presence a balm in the raw, agitated town. She saw the weariness in Evelyn's eyes and offered her a cup of strong coffee without asking too many questions. "This town talks too much," Marisol said one evening, her hands busy mending a shirt. "It is a sickness. They get a story in their teeth and they worry it until it is something ugly and unrecognizable. Be careful, Maestra." Evelyn also came to know Jonah Hale, the blacksmith. His smithy stood at the edge of town, a place of fire and sweat and the rhythmic clang of a hammer on steel. He was a veteran of the war, though he never spoke of it, and a deep sadness lingered in his eyes. He was a man of few words, but he was observant. He saw the way Sheriff Cutter's patrols always seemed to avoid the areas where Pike's surveyors were working. He saw the new rifles the men in Pike's employ carried. He would nod a quiet greeting to Evelyn as she passed on her way to the schoolhouse, his gaze lingering for a moment on the small lamp she lit each evening. The tension in the town finally found a target one afternoon. A small boy, no more than 8 years old, was shoved out of the saloon's swinging doors. He tumbled into the dusty street, his face streaked with tears. He was of mixed heritage, his features a beautiful, delicate blend that the drunken miners saw only as a stain. One of the men followed him out, his face red with liquor and rage. "Get out of here, you little half-breed. We don't want your kind in here." Evelyn was across the street, heading back from the general store, her heart seized. The other townsfolk averted their eyes, pretending not to see, their silence a form of consent, but Evelyn could not. She walked directly into the street, her parcels clutched in her arms, and stood between the man and the child. "That is enough," she said, her voice low but clear, cutting through the man's drunken tirade. The miner sneered. "Well, look what we have here. The schoolmarm. You got something to say, Miss Hart?" "I said that is enough," she repeated, her gaze unwavering. "He is a child." The man hesitated, thrown off by her directness. He looked from her to the boy, then back again. He grumbled something under his breath and, with a final glare, lumbered back into the saloon. Evelyn knelt in the dust, ignoring the stares of the onlookers. She gently took the boy's arm. He had a long scrape on his cheek, and his lip was bleeding. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. He nodded, still sniffling, too frightened to speak. She took out her own handkerchief, dipped it in the water from her canteen, and carefully cleaned the cut on his face. She gave him a small piece of horehound candy from her pocket and walked with him to the small adobe home, where he lived with his mother on the far side of town. She did not preach, she did not lecture. She simply offered a moment of kindness in a world that had shown him none. That night, fear paid her a visit. She was asleep in her small cabin behind the boarding house when a sound jolted her awake, the scraping of a boot on her wooden porch. She lay frozen in her bed, her breath caught in her throat, listening. The latch on her door rattled, then clicked. The door creaked open. A figure slipped inside, a dark shape against the paler darkness of the night. Her heart pounded so hard she was sure it could be heard across the room. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying they would take what they wanted and leave. She heard a soft thud on the floor, then the rustle of movement. After a minute that stretched into an eternity, the figure slipped back out as silently as it had entered. The door clicked shut. Evelyn waited, her body rigid, until the first gray light of dawn began to creep through her window. Only then did she dare to move. Nothing was stolen. Her few coins were still in the jar on the shelf. Her books were untouched, but on her pillow, where her head had been moments before, lay a single page torn from her volume of Shakespeare. On it, a crude drawing of a figure hanging from a noose had been sketched in charcoal. It was a message, a violation aimed directly at who she was. They had not taken her things. They had tried to take her courage. Shaking, she dressed and stepped outside into the cool morning air. And there, on her doorstep, was something else. It was a small pouch made of soft, tanned deerskin and tied with a leather cord. It had not been there before. Hesitantly, she picked it up. It was filled with a mixture of dried leaves and flowers, and it smelled of pine and mint and the clean scent of the earth after a rain. It was not a threat. It felt like an answer, a quiet, unobtrusive gesture of care that stood in stark contrast to the ugly violation of her home. She did not know who had left it, but she knew it was not from anyone in Dry Vale. The thought came to her unbidden, the silent man from the rocks, the one with the still, knowing eyes. Later that day, Sheriff Cutter found her as she was sweeping the porch of the schoolhouse. He leaned against a post, his thumbs hooked in his belt, his presence casting a long, unpleasant shadow. "Heard you had a little excitement last night, Miss Hart," he said, his voice slick with false concern. Evelyn kept sweeping. "I do not know what you mean, Sheriff." "Oh, I think you do. A word of advice. A town like this, it's a delicate balance. People get nervous when folks step out of line, especially when they start consorting with the wrong kind." Her hands tightened on the broom handle. "Are you referring to the child I helped yesterday?" Cutter pushed himself off the post. "I am referring to a schoolteacher minding her own business. Stick to your books and your numbers. It would be a shame if something were to happen that made it impossible for you to continue your important work here." He tipped his hat, a gesture that was more of a threat than a courtesy, and walked away. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, Evelyn stood before her small schoolhouse. Her hands trembled slightly as she struck a match. The fear was a cold knot inside her, real and sharp. But stronger than the fear was a stubborn flame of defiance. She thought of the small boy's tear-streaked face, of the ugly drawing on the page from her book, and of the small, fragrant pouch of herbs that now sat on her bedside table. She lifted the glass of the lamp, touched the match to the wick, and watched the flame catch. It was a small light, easily extinguished, but for now, it burned. It pushed back against the gathering shadows, a fragile but determined beacon in a town that was learning to love the dark. The latest story to fester in Dry Vale concerned a sabotaged water pump on a small ranch north of town. The rancher, a man named Peters, claimed he found tracks leading away toward the Bluestone Hills. The kind of tracks, he said, that only an Apache would make. The tale was embellished with every telling, until by noon the simple act of vandalism had become a full-blown raid, a brazen act of war on the good, hard-working folk of the territory. Evelyn Hart listened to it all, her hands busy grading the crude slates her pupils used for their letters. She heard the certainty in the voices, the righteous anger, and she saw the lie coiled at the heart of it. It was too convenient, too perfectly timed to stoke the fires that Crawford Pike was so carefully tending. Her skepticism was a foreign language in this town, and speaking it would only invite more trouble. But silence felt like a betrayal of the truth she had witnessed in the dust storm. Armed with a full canteen, a small parcel of bread and cheese, and a resolve that felt both foolish and necessary, she told Marisol she was going for a walk to clear her head. She followed the wagon ruts north out of town, toward the low, hazy line of the Bluestone Hills. The land was stark and unforgiving, a tapestry of rock and thorn. The bluestone was not the color of a robin's egg, but a dark, moody slate that fractured under the sun's glare, giving the entire landscape a bruised appearance. The tracks were exactly where Peters had said they would be, and just as she had suspected, they were laughably obvious. A moccasin print pressed too deep here, a broken branch there. It was a trail meant to be found. It was a lie written on the face of the earth. She followed it for over an hour, her city-bred shoes protesting against the sharp rocks. The trail led her into a shallow basin, a natural amphitheater of weathered stone, and there it was, the remains of a small campfire. The ashes were cold, but not old. She knelt, her schoolteacher's eye for detail taking in the scene, a discarded tin of beans, the label half peeled away, the faint, sweet smell of chewing tobacco. These were small but telling inconsistencies, and then she saw them. Gleaming like treacherous gold in the afternoon sun were two small brass cylinders. She picked one up. It was a shell casing, heavier than it looked. She had seen men loading rifles like it back east, a .44, Henry rimfire. It was the ammunition for a repeating rifle, a weapon favored by settlers, soldiers, and hired guns. It was not the weapon of a people who hunted with the bow and the lance. She closed her fingers around the small piece of metal. It was cold and hard and undeniable. It was the truth. A pebble skittered down the rock face behind her. Evelyn froze, her blood turning to ice. She had been so focused on the ground that she had forgotten to watch the world around her. She rose slowly, turning. 3 men stood on the rim of the basin, their figures silhouetted against the bright sky. They were not Apache. They were white men, with the hard, sun-scorched faces of men who lived by the gun. She recognized 2 of them from Pike's entourage. "Well now," one of them said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Looks like the schoolmarm got herself lost." "I was just walking," Evelyn said, her voice surprisingly steady. She slipped the casing into her dress pocket. "Walking all the way out here," the man said, beginning to circle around the basin's edge with the other 2, their movements coordinated, predatory. "You find anything interesting on your little walk?" Evelyn did not answer. There was no point in lying, and no hope in the truth. These men were not here to talk. They were here to erase a mistake. Her mistake had been finding this place. Theirs had been leaving evidence behind. She took a step back, her eyes darting around for an escape route. But there was none. The rock walls were too steep. The man who had spoken raised his rifle, not to his shoulder, but held casually across his chest. It was a gesture of absolute power. "Mr. Pike doesn't like folks who get too curious. He said he considers it bad for business and bad for their health." He took another step, and Evelyn braced herself. The world seemed to shrink to the small, dusty space between them, the shimmering air, the cold weight of the brass in her pocket. Then came a sound, a soft hiss, like a snake striking. The man with the rifle grunted, a look of shocked surprise on his face. He staggered back, clutching at his shoulder, where the feathered shaft of an arrow now protruded. Before the other 2 could even react, 2 more arrows flew from the rocks above, striking one in the thigh and the other in the arm. They cried out in pain and surprise, their bravado evaporating in an instant. They were hunters who had suddenly found themselves the prey. Nantan moved from behind a rock outcropping so silently it was as if he had materialized from the stone itself. He held a bow in one hand, another arrow already knocked on the string. He did not look at Evelyn. His entire focus was on the 3 wounded men, who were now scrambling to get away, their mission of murder forgotten in their panic to save themselves. Nantan let them go, watching as they stumbled and fled back toward the plains. He was a force of nature, a guardian of this place, and he had acted with the same impersonal efficiency as a hawk stooping on a rabbit. When they were gone, an unnerving silence settled over the basin. Nantan lowered his bow. Only then did he turn his gaze to Evelyn. It was the same look she remembered from the dust storm, an unnerving combination of stillness and intensity. It was the look of a man who saw everything. He walked toward her, his moccasins making no sound on the rock. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes falling to the pocket of her dress where her hand was protectively covering the shell casing. He did not need to ask what she had found. He already knew. Without a word, he turned and gestured with his head for her to follow. There was no menace in the command, only a quiet authority she found impossible to disobey. She followed him out of the basin and into a narrow, winding canyon she had not seen before, a hidden passage that cut deep into the heart of the hills. The canyon walls rose steeply on either side, blotting out the sun and muffling the sound of the wind. The air grew cooler. It felt as if they had entered another world, a secret and sacred place far removed from the lies of Dry Vale. They walked in silence for a long time. Just as the shadows began to lengthen, the wind began to howl through the upper reaches of the canyon. A fine dust began to filter down, and within minutes, the air was thick with it. Nantan pulled her into a shallow alcove, a hollow in the rock wall. Just as the full force of the sandstorm hit, they were pressed close together in the small space, sheltered from the stinging wind. Evelyn could feel the warmth of his body, smell the faint, clean scent of sage and pine that clung to him. The roar of the wind was a living thing, scouring the world outside their small refuge, in the enforced intimacy of the storm. The silence between them was no longer tense, but thoughtful. When the wind finally began to abate, he spoke, his voice low and calm. "They will not stop. The man Pike, he wants the land. He does not care who bleeds for it." "I know," Evelyn said, her voice barely a whisper. "He hired those men." Nantan nodded, as if she were merely confirming something he had long understood. He led her deeper into the canyon as twilight settled. The air grew heavy with moisture and the smell of sulfur. They rounded a final bend, and the canyon opened into a small, hidden oasis. A pool of water, steaming in the cool evening air, was surrounded by ferns and smooth, warm rocks. It was a place of impossible green in the middle of the arid landscape, a place of healing. "This is a place of my people," Nantan said, his voice softer now. "The water comes from the heart of the earth. It is where we come to heal our wounds, to speak to our ancestors. It is not for outsiders." Evelyn stood at the edge of the pool, mesmerized by the quiet beauty of the place. "Why did you bring me here?" "Because you saw the truth, and because they tried to bury you with it. Here, the lies of your town cannot reach." He looked at her then, his gaze direct and searching. "You must promise me. You will not speak of this place. You will not lead others here. The world of men like Pike must never touch it." "I promise," she said without hesitation. It was an easy promise to make. This place felt like a prayer, and she would not be the one to desecrate it. "They say we are ghosts," Nantan continued, his eyes on the steam rising from the water. "Savages who raid and burn. They do not see our children. They do not know the names of our dead. The iron road Pike builds. It will cut through the ground where my grandfather is buried, where his father is buried. We do not fight for land you can own. We fight for our memory. We are not attacking. We are defending." His words were simple, direct, and they carried the weight of generations. Evelyn reached into her pocket and pulled out the brass shell casing. She held it out to him on her palm. "This is their truth," she said, "not yours." He looked at the casing but made no move to take it. He looked at her face, at the sincerity and the fear and the courage, all mingled in her eyes. A flicker of something, a deep and ancient sadness, passed through his own. "The world is full of their truth," he said. "Be careful it does not become yours." He showed her how to find water in the desert, how to read the stars to find her way. He shared a small piece of dried meat with her. They did not speak of the future, or of what she should do. They spoke of the things around them, the names of the plants, the habits of the coyote. It was a simple, elemental exchange, a quiet building of trust in a hidden place, while the high desert night grew cold and deep and silent around them, as the moon rose over the canyon walls, casting a silver light on the steaming water. Evelyn Hart knew she was caught between two worlds, and she knew that whichever one she chose, her life would never again be simple. He did not take her back toward Dryvale. Instead, he led her higher into the mountains, following game trails so faint they seemed to be memories etched upon the land rather than actual paths. The world grew greener, the air thinner and sharper. Evelyn, accustomed to the orderly streets of Boston, found a strange rhythm in the climb, her body learning to read the language of the terrain, to anticipate the slide of loose shale and the purchase of solid granite. This was a world that demanded attention, a world that stripped away all that was unnecessary. They arrived at the seasonal camp as the sun was warming the high peaks. It was not the chaotic, menacing village of the stories told in town. It was a place of quiet, ordered life, nestled in a valley blessed with a clear, running stream and a stand of tall pines. The dwellings were wickiups, domed structures of willow branches and brush, blending so perfectly with the landscape that they seemed to have grown from it. The scent of pine and wood smoke filled the air, a fragrance of home and continuity. Women were grinding corn on stone metates, their movements rhythmic and ancient, Children chased each other with shrieks of laughter, their games as universal as the sun that warmed their faces. Nantan's return caused no great stir, but a quiet acknowledgement rippled through the camp. People nodded to him, their expressions respectful but also questioning as their eyes fell on Evelyn. She felt like a page from a different book, her dusty traveling dress and worn shoes a stark contrast to the soft deerskin and natural grace of the people around her. She was an intrusion, a dissonance in their harmony. A woman with Nantan's strong, high cheekbones and serious eyes emerged from one of the larger wiki-ups. She was wiping her hands on a leather apron, and her gaze, as it met Evelyn's, was filled with a fierce, protective intelligence. This was his sister, Annaba. Nantan spoke to her in their own tongue, his voice a low, melodic murmur. Her eyes remained on Evelyn, assessing, searching. Finally, she gave a slight nod and gestured for Evelyn to enter her dwelling. Inside, it was cool and dim. Woven blankets lay over beds of soft branches, and the air smelled of herbs and cedar. Annaba handed Evelyn a gourd of cool water, a simple gesture of hospitality that seemed to bridge a vast cultural chasm. The peace was soon broken. A young man, his body lean and taut with anger, strode to the entrance of the wiki-up. His face was a mask of suspicion. This was Naichi, Nantan's cousin. He spoke rapidly to Nantan, his words sharp and challenging, his gestures pointing toward Evelyn. Though she could not understand the language, she understood the meaning perfectly. He was accusing Nantan of bringing danger into their home. Nantan's reply was calm and measured, his voice never rising, but it held an iron authority that made Naichi fall silent. An older man, his face a beautiful web of wrinkles and his long hair gray, approached and laid a hand on Naichi's arm. This was Shash Bito, the medicine man. He did not speak, but his eyes, deep and knowing, rested on Evelyn with a disconcerting clarity, as if he could see the shell casing she still carried in her pocket and the turmoil she carried in her heart. The debate, Evelyn realized, was not just about her, it was about survival. It was the eternal question of a people under siege, whether to hide and endure or to stand and fight. Naichi, young and proud, was the voice for war. Nantan, burdened with the lives of his people, sought a different path, a way to preserve their world without drenching it in blood. Annaba, ignoring the tension, set a bowl of stew made from corn and venison before Evelyn. As Evelyn ate, her gaze fell upon a piece of coarse burlap used to patch a tear in a basket of dried roots. The fabric was unremarkable, except for 3 faded black letters stenciled near the edge, T as Arse, Transcontinental Rail Company. It was the same logo she had seen on Crawford Pike's wagons, on his stationery, on the very tools that were carving up this land. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She looked at Annaba, who was tending to a small child. Then, back at the basket, it was a piece of refuse, most likely scavenged from the gear discarded by the fake raiders after their clumsy attack. They had left more behind than just shell casings. They had left a direct link to their employer. Later, as the sun began to cast long shadows through the valley, Nantan found her by the stream. The children were splashing in the shallows, their laughter echoing off the canyon walls. Naichi does not trust outsiders, Nantan said, his voice quiet. He has seen too many promises turn to smoke. He is right to be cautious, Evelyn replied, her gaze on the piece of burlap she now held clutched in her hand, hidden in the folds of her skirt. My presence here puts you all in danger. My people are already in danger, he said, his eyes scanning the valley, the weight of his responsibility etched on his face. Pike's iron road will not go around our dead. He will dig them up. We can run, hide higher in the mountains until the snows come, or we can fight, and our women and children will pay the price for the pride of our warriors. There is no easy path. It was here, in this moment of shared vulnerability, that Evelyn felt the true nature of her own conflict, the ridicule she faced in Dry Vale, the loss of her reputation as the proper Virin lady. It was all so trivial compared to the choice Nantan faced, a choice between the desecration of his ancestors and the destruction of his children. "Perhaps there is another way," she said, her voice barely audible over the sound of the stream. "The truth, if people knew the truth about Pike, about the attacks." "Your people believe the truths they are told," Nantan said, a note of weariness in his voice. "They will not listen to you. They will not listen to us." "Some might," she insisted, thinking of Marisol's quiet kindness and Jonah Hale's observant eyes. "It is not a choice between fighting and running. It is a choice between darkness and light. My small lamp at the schoolhouse, it does not light up the whole town, but it pushes back the darkness in one small corner. Perhaps the truth is like that." He looked at her for a long time, the setting sun catching the deep, dark intelligence in his eyes. He was a leader, a warrior, a man responsible for the soul of his people. But in that moment, she also saw the man, a man struggling with an impossible burden, and her heart went out to him. A feeling, new and unsettling and powerful, began to take root in her, a feeling as wild and profound as the landscape around them. As she prepared to leave the next morning before dawn, Anaba came to her. She pressed something cool and heavy into Evelyn's hand. It was a bracelet, crafted from a single, heavy piece of silver. Etched into its surface was a delicate, repeating pattern of lines and angles, a design that seemed to capture the very essence of falling rain. "This was my mother's," Anaba said softly. "In a dry land, rain is a promise. It is life. It is protection. My brother asked that you have it." Evelyn slid the bracelet onto her wrist. It fit as if it had been made for her. It was more than a gift. It was a commitment, a tangible link to this hidden world and to the man who had brought her here. She had come to the mountains, seeking evidence, and had found a cause. She carried two things with her as Nantan guided her back down the secret trails toward the plains. In her pocket, she had a small, damning piece of burlap. On her wrist, she wore a silver prayer for rain. One was a weapon against a lie. The other was a shield for her own heart. She was no longer just a teacher. She was a witness, and she knew, as she looked back at the mountains that held their promise so well, that she could not, would not, remain silent. The board was set, the pieces were in motion, and she, the Virin lady of Dry Vale, was about to make her move. The return journey was a descent into a world of shadows and whispers. Nantan guided her along the moon-slick edges of ravines, his movements as silent and sure as the night birds that swooped above them. They were being hunted. The 3 men she had encountered in the basin had reported back to Pike, and the response was swift and merciless. Twice they had to flatten themselves into crevices as the clatter of shod hooves echoed through the canyons, the voices of Pike's men carrying on the cold air, coarse and brutal. During one hasty scramble down a rock fall, a ricocheting bullet, fired blindly into the darkness, tore a shallow furrow along Nantan's ribs. He grunted, a sharp intake of breath, but did not slow his pace. He led her onward, his hand gripping her arm to steady her, his own pain a tightly held secret. They finally found sanctuary in the hidden canyon, the small oasis with its steaming pool a haven in the hostile dark, while Evelyn huddled in the ferns, catching her breath. Nantan slipped into the hot spring. The water, heated by the earth's core, would cleanse the wound and ease the ache in his muscles. He leaned his head back against a smooth, warm rock, the steam rising around him like a shroud, masking the lines of pain on his face. He was exhausted, the constant vigilance and the weight of his responsibility a heavier burden than any physical injury. Evelyn, her own body trembling with fatigue and fear, rose to check on him. The moonlight filtered into the oasis, painting the scene in silver and black. She saw him in the water, his powerful shoulders and the dark shape of his head stark against the pale steam. The rocks at the pool's edge were slick with condensation and moss. As she stepped closer, her worn shoe slipped on a wet patch of stone. Her arms flailed for a balance she could not find, and with a small cry of surprise, she tumbled forward, landing with a great splash in the warm, chest-deep water. The shock of the immersion stole her breath. She came up sputtering, her heavy dress clinging to her like a second skin. Nantan was beside her in an instant, his hands gripping her arms to steady her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. She shook her head, pushing wet hair from her eyes. A laugh, born of sheer nervous exhaustion, bubbled up from her chest. "Only my dignity," she managed to say. The absurdity of the situation, after a night of running for their lives, was too much. A slow smile touched Nantan's lips, a rare and startling sight that transformed his stern features. He laughed with her, a quiet, deep sound that seemed to come from the very earth beneath them. As their laughter subsided, a profound silence settled between them, broken only by the gentle burble of the spring and the whisper of the steam. In the soft light, she could see the long, puckered line of an old scar that ran across his shoulder, a pale track on his dark skin. Without thinking, moved by an instinct to understand the pain he had known, she reached out and laid her hand gently upon it. The touch was feather-light, yet it seemed to pass a current between them. He did not pull away. His own hand, which had been steadying her elbow, moved to cover hers, his fingers strong and warm. He had caught more than just her hand. In that moment, he held her trust, her fear, her fragile courage, all of it, in his grasp. He drew her closer until they were standing face to face, the water swirling around them. He did not need to speak. His eyes, dark and deep as the pool itself, said everything. He was her protector. She was his purpose. 2 days later, the poison seeped into Dry Vale. It appeared overnight, tacked to the door of the saloon, the wall of the general store, and the post of the church. It was a cheaply printed flyer, the ink already starting to run, but the words were stark and ugly, designed to inflame and degrade. At the top, in large, sensational letters, was a headline that twisted their moment of quiet trust into something vile. The Virin lady slipped right into his bath. The Apache chief caught more than just her hand. The story below was a crude and vicious fabrication, a lurid tale that painted Evelyn as a wanton traitor and Nantan as a savage brute. It took the most private, innocent moment of her life and held it up for public ridicule, turning a symbol of healing into a weapon of shame. The effect was immediate and devastating. The town that had been suspicious of her now openly scorned her. When she walked down the main street, conversations stopped. Women pulled their children closer and turned their faces away. Men looked at her with a new, leering contempt. The small flame of respect she had so carefully kindled was extinguished, smothered by a wave of manufactured scandal. Her reputation, the only currency she possessed in this harsh land, was worthless. The isolation was a physical presence, a wall of silence and disgust that followed her everywhere. She found her small schoolhouse empty, the benches vacant. The lamp by the door seemed to mock her with its cold, unlit wick. The confrontation she had been dreading came that afternoon. "Sheriff Amos Cutter," the flyer crumpled in his fist, blocked her path as she tried to enter the boarding house. 2 of his deputies, hulking men with vacant eyes, stood behind him. "Well, well, Miss Hart," Cutter sneered, his voice loud enough for everyone on the street to hear. "Looks like your little secrets are out." Evelyn stood tall, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "That paper is a lie, Sheriff, and you know it." "What I know," he said, stepping closer, his bulk crowding her, "is that we have a serious problem with Apache raids. And what I have here is proof that you've been consorting with the enemy. aiding and abetting savages. That's treason in this territory. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. You're under arrest. Let her go. Cut her. The voice was low and steady, like the rumble of distant thunder. Jonah Hale stepped out of his smithy, a heavy blacksmith's hammer held loosely in one hand. He was not brandishing it as a weapon, but its presence was a clear and potent statement. His face, usually shadowed with a quiet sadness, was set in a hard, determined line. At the same time, Marisol Ortega came out onto the porch of the boarding house. "Sheriff," she said, her voice calm but carrying an authority that made even Cutter pause. "You have no warrant. You are making a spectacle of yourself and frightening my boarders. Release Miss Hart at once." Cutter was caught off guard. He had expected Evelyn to be alone, an easy target. He had not counted on the town's quiet blacksmith and its most respected woman standing with her. He looked from Jonah's hammer to Marisol's unwavering gaze. He was a bully, and bullies falter when faced with unexpected strength. He hesitated, his grip on Evelyn's arm faltering. "This ain't over," he snarled, finally letting her go with a shove. "I'm watching you, all of you." He turned and stomped away, his deputies trailing behind him like curs. In the mountains, a scout brought the news to Nantan's camp, along with one of the filthy flyers. He read the words, his face becoming a mask of cold fury. The white men had not only trespassed on his land and tried to kill him, now they had taken the one clean thing he had found in their world and tried to defile it. They had used her to strike at him. Naichi saw the flyer and his anger exploded. "This is what comes of trusting them," he raged. "She has brought this shame upon us. We must strike back. We must burn their town." But Nantan looked past his own rage. He saw the deeper strategy. Pike wanted him to attack. He wanted blood in the streets of Dry Vale to justify a full-scale war. A war that would clear the land for his railroad once and for all. And now, seeing the ugly words on the page, Nantan felt a surge of guilt. He had brought Evelyn into his world, and in doing so, had exposed her to the worst of hers. His duty as a leader warred with the protective instinct that now burned in his soul. For a moment, he considered the wisdom of retreat, of pulling his people so deep into the mountains that no white man could ever find them. But then he looked at the silver bracelet on his own wrist, a mate to the one he had given her. Rain was a promise. It was life. Running would save their bodies, but it would kill their spirit. It would surrender the memory of their ancestors to the shovels of the railroad. He would not run. He looked at Naichi, his eyes blazing with a new, cold fire. "We will not fight their battle," he said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "We will fight ours." Back in Dry Vale, Evelyn stood with Marisol and Jonah in the quiet kitchen of the boarding house. She was shaking, but her spirit was not broken. The flyer had been meant to isolate her, to leave her defenseless. Instead, it had forged an alliance. She was no longer alone. "They meant to destroy me," Evelyn said, her voice trembling but firm. "But all they did was show me who my friends are." She looked at the blacksmith and the compassionate woman beside her, and a new strength flowed into her. The shame was not hers. It belonged to the men who dealt in lies. "We will stand for the truth," she declared, her voice resonating with a conviction that surprised even herself. The battle lines had been drawn, not in the dust of the desert, but in the hearts of those who would choose courage over fear. The Sunday bell in Dry Vale no longer called the faithful to prayer. It sounded an alarm. Its frantic, insistent clang echoed off the false fronts of the town and rolled across the dusty plains. A summons to judgment. Inside the small, sweltering church, Reverend Harlan Briggs stood in his pulpit, his face flushed with righteous fire. The sermon had begun with scripture but had quickly veered into a call to arms. "The serpent is in our garden," he thundered, his fist striking the worn wood of the pulpit. "It coils in the shadows of the hills. It poisons our wells. It threatens our very homes. We have been patient. We have been civilized. But the savage understands only one language, the language of strength, the language of the righteous sword. The pews were packed. Men who had not seen the inside of a church in months sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces grim and attentive, their fear, carefully nurtured by weeks of rumor and lies, had ripened into a hard, communal anger. Evelyn Hart sat in the back, a small island of stillness in a churning sea of emotion. She could feel the heat of their hatred, a palpable force that seemed to suck the very air from the room. Crawford Pike sat in the front pew, a model of civic concern. He rose at a signal from the Reverend, his expression somber. "Reverend Briggs speaks the truth," he said, his voice resonating with calm authority. "My company, the Transcontinental Rail Company, is not just building a railroad. We are building a future of prosperity and order. But that future cannot be built on a foundation of fear. We cannot allow our progress to be held hostage by a few renegades who refuse to accept the march of civilization." He let his words hang in the air, then delivered the master stroke. "Therefore, as a concerned citizen, I am offering a bounty, $50 in gold for any man who helps drive this menace from our hills, a reward for every warrior who is persuaded to leave this territory for good. It is not a call for violence. It is a call for security. It is a call for order." A low murmur went through the crowd. $50 was a fortune to most of the men in that room. It was more than a month's wages in the mines, a chance to pay off a debt, to start a new life. Pike was not just offering them money. He was offering them a righteous cause, a way to turn their fear into profit. As the congregation spilled out of the church into the blinding sunlight, their talk was no longer of God, but of gold and guns. Sheriff Cutter was already there, a list in his hand, signing up volunteers for a posse. The sound of their boots on the boardwalk was the sound of a gathering army. Then, a clear voice cut through the excited din. "There will be no hunt today." Evelyn Hart stepped forward from the shadows of the church doorway. Marisol and Jonah flanked her, their presence a silent, solid declaration of support. The crowd parted before her, a wave of hostile silence falling over them. All eyes were on the schoolteacher, the woman they had been taught to scorn. "You speak of an Apache menace," Evelyn said, her voice carrying across the street. "Steady and strong, but the only menace in this valley is the lie you have all been fed." Crawford Pike turned, a look of mild annoyance on his face. "Miss Hart, this is hardly the time or the place for your misplaced sympathies." "This is the perfect time and place," she countered. Stepping into the center of the street, she held up a small, grimy piece of burlap. The faded letters Tiarsul were clearly visible. This was found at the scene of the supposed Apache raid on the Peters Ranch. A strange thing for a savage to be carrying. Do you not think? A few men in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Pike's expression tightened. "A piece of trash. It proves nothing." And this Evelyn held up the small brass shell casing, a .44 caliber Henry rifle cartridge, also found at the scene. "Is that the weapon of the Apache, Mr. Pike? Or is it the weapon of the men you hire?" The crowd was murmuring now, the certainty beginning to crack. Jonah Hale stepped forward. "I treated one of the men wounded in the raid on the wagon train," he said, his voice a low growl. "A man named Jed. Pike paid him and the others to dress up like Indians and scare folks. When Jed got hurt, Pike left him to die. But before he passed, he gave me this." Jonah held up a folded piece of paper. "It's a pay voucher, signed by Mr. Crawford Pike, for services rendered." The air crackled with tension. Evelyn took the paper from Jonah and held it up for all to see. It was the final, undeniable link in the chain of deceit. The truth, stark and irrefutable, was laid bare in the dusty street. Pike's composure finally broke. His face, a moment before a mask of civic virtue, contorted into a snarl of pure fury. With a speed that was shocking, he lunged forward. Snatching the voucher from Evelyn's hand, he turned to the lantern hanging on the post outside the saloon, smashed the glass with the back of his hand, and thrust the paper into the open flame. It caught, curled, and turned to black ash in an instant. "Lies!" he roared, turning on the stunned crowd. "All of it. Lies cooked up by this traitorous woman and her half-breed friends. She is the one who consorts with savages. She is the one who has bewitched this town with her eastern ways and her godless books. She brought this curse upon us." He pointed a trembling finger at Evelyn. "She is a witch." He then rounded on Sheriff Cutter, who stood dumbfounded, the recruitment list dangling from his hand. "And you incompetent fool. You let this happen under your very nose. I hold you responsible for this chaos." It was a masterful, desperate performance. In the space of 30 seconds, he had destroyed the evidence, deflected the blame, and turned the mob's anger from a phantom enemy onto a flesh-and-blood woman. The men, confused and volatile, looked from Pike's raging face to Evelyn's pale, resolute one. Their greed for the bounty warred with the seed of doubt she had planted. For a moment, the entire town teetered on the brink of an explosion. Just then, the sky, which had been a merciless, hammered blue, began to change. A gray pallor spread from the west, and the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. A low rumble of thunder, far more real than the Reverend's manufactured pronouncements, echoed from the mountains. The sudden shift in the weather seemed to break the spell. The crowd, uncertain and unnerved, began to disperse, melting back into the saloon and their homes, leaving Evelyn, Jonah, and Marisol standing alone in the street. That night, as an unseasonable, drenching rain turned the streets of Dry Vale into a thick, clinging mud, the four of them met in the back room of Jonah's smithy. The fourth was a silent, shadowy figure who had slipped into town under the cover of the storm. It was Nantan. Jonah had sent word through a trusted channel, a young Apache boy who worked at the livery, and Nantan had come. The air in the smithy was thick with the smells of coal smoke, hot metal, and wet earth. A single lantern cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. Evelyn explained the day's events, her voice low and urgent. "Pike is desperate," she concluded. "He will not stop until he has what he wants, or until he is exposed so completely that even his money cannot protect him." "He wants a war," Nantan said, his voice a quiet rumble. "He tried to make me the villain. Now he will make you the villain. It does not matter to him who bleeds, as long as the ground is cleared for his iron road." "Then we have to set a trap he cannot resist," Jonah said, leaning over a table cluttered with tools. "We have to use his own greed against him." The plan was born in that small, shadowed room, a desperate gamble forged in the heart of the storm. They would feed Pike's arrogance. They would give him the victory he so craved. Jonah, using the skills he had learned in the war, would create a number of grisly, but fake, trophies. Marisol would provide the materials: old leather, horsehair from the livery, dyes made from berries and rust. They would arrange a delivery, a collection of supposed Apache scalps for which Pike's men could claim the bounty. "He will want to see the proof himself," Marisol said, her face grim. "A man like that trusts no one. He will have to count the spoils with his own hands." "The old windmill, west of town," Jonah suggested. "It is isolated. We can control the approaches." Nantan listened, his face unreadable. His every instinct screamed for direct action, for the clean, swift justice of a warrior. But he saw the wisdom in their plan. It was a white man's trap for a white man's crime. His role would be the most difficult. He and his warriors would have to remain hidden, to be the unseen witnesses. They would have to trust in the courage of these new allies, to allow justice to unfold without letting their own anger consume them. The rain fell harder, a relentless drumbeat on the corrugated iron roof of the smithy. It complicated everything, turning the ground to a treacherous mire, making silent movement all but impossible. But it also provided a cloak, a shroud of darkness and noise that might just be enough to hide their preparations. The trap was set. The bait was being prepared. And as the storm raged outside, The small, unlikely alliance pledged themselves to a final, violent accounting. The abandoned windmill stood west of town like a skeletal sentinel, its broken arms reaching beseechingly toward the bruised and starless sky. The unseasonable rain had passed, leaving behind a world of thick, black mud that sucked at a man's boots and a damp, chilling air that clung to the skin. This was a place of decay, where the ambition to grind grain had long ago surrendered to the slow, relentless power of the wind and the sun. Tonight, it was to be a place of reckoning. Jonah Hale moved through the shadows, the heavy sack slung over his shoulder a grotesque parody of a miller's burden. Inside, the fake trophies he and Marisol had so grimly crafted were packed in damp straw. He felt a cold knot of dread in his stomach, a feeling he had not known so acutely since the war. He was a blacksmith, a mender of things, yet tonight he was a purveyor of a lie, a participant in a dangerous masquerade. From a thicket of salt cedar 100 yards away, Evelyn Hart watched, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Marisol was beside her, a steady, silent presence in the oppressive dark. Their job was to watch, to wait for the transaction to be completed, and then to send a signal, a brief flash of a shielded lantern to the town officials they had secretly alerted. A federal marshal who was passing through and had listened to their story with a weary, non-committal interest. It was a fragile hope, but it was their only one. Deeper in the shadows, scattered among the rocks that ringed the small clearing, Nantan and a dozen of his warriors lay motionless. They were ghosts of the night, their forms blending with the dark earth. Among them was Naichi, his body vibrating with a suppressed, violent energy. He had argued against this plan, this reliance on the white man's trickery. He believed only in the swift justice of the arrow and the lance. He held his bow, its string taut, his knuckles white. Nantan had given him a direct order to observe, to not interfere, but the command chafed against Naichi's rage like a raw wound. The sound of horses slogging through the mud announced their arrival. Crawford Pike, Sheriff Cutter, and 4 of their hired guns rode into the clearing. Pike dismounted with an impatient grunt, his fine boots sinking into the mire. "Let us get this over with," Pike said, his voice a low, ugly rasp. "Show me what my money has bought." Jonah dropped the heavy sack onto the ground with a soft, sickening thud. He did not speak, his face a grim mask in the dim lantern light. Cutter stepped forward and kicked the sack. "Open it," he commanded. Jonah untied the leather cord and spilled the contents onto a relatively dry patch of ground. In the flickering light, the mock scalps were a horrifying sight. The horsehair matted with the dark, sticky dye Marisol had concocted. They were a lie made manifest, an ugly testament to the depths of Pike's corruption. Pike knelt, poking at one of the gruesome objects with the toe of his boot. A slow, triumphant smile spread across his face. This was what he had wanted. Tangible proof. A justification for everything. "Excellent," he said, looking up at Jonah. "You have earned your pay." He reached into his coat and produced a leather pouch heavy with coin. It was the sight of the money changing hands, the final, profane insult of commerce for the memory of his people, that broke Naichi's control. In his mind, it did not matter that the objects were fake. The intent was real. The disrespect was real. A low snarl escaped his lips. Before Nantan could move to stop him, Naichi rose from the shadows, drew his bow, and let an arrow fly. The shaft hissed through the night air and buried itself in the wooden post of the windmill, a mere foot from Pike's head. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. Then, chaos erupted. Pike's men reacted instantly, their pistols barking fire into the darkness. Pike himself scrambled backward, his face a mask of fury and shock. Sheriff Cutter, seeing Jonah as the source of the ambush, did not hesitate. He drew his revolver, aimed, and fired. A blossom of fire erupted from the barrel. Jonah cried out, a sharp, guttural sound of pain, and staggered back, clutching his side as he fell into the mud. Evelyn screamed his name, her carefully held composure shattering. She started to rise from their hiding place, but Marisol pulled her back down. "Stay down," she hissed. "You will be killed." The clearing was now a maelstrom of muzzle flashes and shouting. Pike's men, unsure of how many attackers they faced, fired wildly into the surrounding rocks. Wood splintered from the windmill. Bullets whined through the air, dangerously close to where Evelyn and Marisol were hiding. In the midst of the chaos, a new, terrified sound pierced the night. It was the cry of a child. From a small, dilapidated shack near the edge of the clearing, a place Evelyn had not even noticed, the young mixed heritage girl she had once defended stumbled out into the open, awakened and terrified by the gunfire. She was running blindly, her small face a pale smudge of terror in the dark. She was heading directly into the crossfire. From his vantage point, Nantan saw the entire tragedy unfold in a series of stark, terrible images. Naichi's foolish, impulsive rage, Jonah, his newfound ally, bleeding in the mud, and now, the two people who represented the heart of his conflict, Evelyn and the innocent child, both trapped in a web of violence they had not created. His duty and his heart were at war. He saw Naichi, pinned down behind a rock, returning fire with a desperate fury. His blood, his kin, called to him. But then he saw Evelyn, trying to crawl toward Jonah and the small child, frozen with terror in the middle of the deadly clearing. His choice was instantaneous and absolute. A leader does not save the strong. He protects the vulnerable. He moved not like a man, but like a shadow detaching itself from the greater darkness. He let out a sharp, piercing cry, a hawk's scream that drew the attention of two of Pike's gunmen. As they turned to fire at the sound, Nantan was already moving in the other direction, a blur of motion, silent and deadly. He reached the child first, scooping her up into his arms. She was light, a fragile bundle of terror. He then lunged toward Evelyn, grabbing her arm with a grip of iron. "Come," he commanded, his voice a low, urgent growl in her ear. He pulled her along, using his own body to shield them both, zigzagging through the deadly space. A bullet tore through the sleeve of his shirt. Another splintered the ground at his feet. He did not falter. He half dragged, half carried them toward the relative safety of the rocks on the far side of the clearing. As he moved, one of Pike's men knocked over the lantern that had illuminated the grisly transaction. It shattered on the floor inside the windmill, and the oil spilled across the dry, tinder-like wood. A small tongue of flame licked up, then another. Nantan pushed Evelyn and the child into a deep crevice between two large boulders. "Stay here," he ordered. "Do not move." Before she could answer, he was gone, melting back into the battle. A phantom of vengeance moving to save the rest of his men and the wounded blacksmith. Evelyn huddled in the darkness, clutching the trembling child to her chest. She could see the battle raging, a chaotic dance of light and shadow. The windmill was now burning in earnest. Flames climbed its ancient wooden frame. A roaring, hungry beast against the black sky. The great, broken sails, silhouetted against the fire, looked like the arms of a tortured giant. The internal gears, caught by the wind, began to groan and turn, the great wheel of rumor and lies now being consumed by the very fire it had helped to kindle. The plan was in ashes. Jonah was wounded, and the night was on fire. The retreat from the burning windmill was a nightmare of mud and desperation. Nantan's warriors formed a protective screen, melting into the darkness to harry their pursuers, while Nantan himself, with help from a grim-faced Marisol, half carried, half dragged the wounded Jonah Hale away from the chaos. Evelyn followed, the terrified child still clinging to her, her small body trembling with each gunshot that echoed from behind them. They fled toward Arroyo Seco, a deep, dry wash carved into the earth by 1,000 years of sudden, violent floods. In the darkness, Its steep, crumbling banks offered the only defensible ground. They stumbled into the arroyo just as the first hint of gray began to soften the eastern sky. The air was cold and heavy with the smell of wet dirt and gunpowder. Nantan gently laid Jonah down in the shelter of an undercut bank, where Marisol immediately began to tear strips from her petticoat to bind his wound. Crawford Pike and his men were not far behind. They did not ride into the arroyo, but took up positions along the rim, trapping them in the narrow channel. The scattered gunfire resumed, bullets thudding into the earthen banks and whining off the rocks. Pike's voice, a braying, triumphant sound, echoed in the pre-dawn stillness.
"Nowhere left to run. You savages, we have you boxed in."
It was then that Evelyn saw it, tucked into a deeper alcove on the opposite bank. Partially covered by a canvas tarp were several wooden crates, a long, dark line, like a coiled snake, snaked from the crates and up the side of the arroyo to where Pike stood. A fuse. The windmill had not been the final trap. It had been the bait. This was the true slaughterhouse. Pike had herded them exactly where he wanted them. His plan was not just to kill Nantan. It was to annihilate them all in a single, massive explosion. A final, bloody act that could be blamed on an Apache uprising. "He is going to bury us," Evelyn whispered, her voice tight with horror. As if in answer, one of Pike's men knelt beside him, a lantern in his hand. "Light it!" Pike roared. A small, orange spark flared on the canyon rim. The fuse sputtered to life, a tiny, hissing point of light that began to eat its way steadily down the bank toward the crates of dynamite. Time seemed to slow. Evelyn looked at the wounded Jonah, at Marisol's determined face, at the small child now huddled in Marisol's arms. She looked at Nantan, who was crouched by a rock, his bow in hand, his face a mask of cold fury as he realized the full, horrific scope of Pike's plan. They were all going to die. A fire, hotter and brighter than any fear, ignited in Evelyn's soul. She would not die here, not like this, not as a footnote in a liar's history. She was a teacher, a woman of books and reason, but in that moment, she was something more. She was a force of opposition. Before anyone could stop her, she scrambled from their shelter and began to run, her feet slipping and sliding in the thick mud, her eyes fixed on the burning fuse. "Evelyn, no!" Marisol cried out. Nantan turned, his eyes widening in disbelief as he saw her desperate, suicidal charge. He started to move after her, but at that moment, Pike and his men unleashed a volley of fire, pinning him down. The world for Evelyn shrank to the sizzling fuse. It was a race against a tiny, crawling star. The mud was a greedy monster, grabbing at her ankles, trying to pull her down. A bullet sang past her ear. Another kicked up a spray of mud beside her foot. She did not slow. She could smell the acrid smoke of the burning cord, could hear its deadly hiss over the sound of the gunshots and the pounding of her own blood in her ears. She reached it just as the spark was a mere 10 feet from the crates. She did not have a knife. She did not have time. She threw herself onto the fuse, grabbing the burning cord with her bare hands. Searing pain shot up her arms, but she held on, smothering the flame, grinding the burning embers into the wet dirt with a desperate, primal force. She felt the skin on her palms blister and break, but she did not let go until the last spark was extinguished. She had done it. She collapsed onto the ground, panting, the smell of her own burned flesh sharp in her nostrils. Her act of defiance was the signal Nantan had been waiting for. With a warrior's cry that was pure, distilled rage, he launched himself up the arroyo bank, directly toward Pike. He moved with a speed and ferocity that was terrifying, a force of nature unleashed. He did not use his bow. This was personal. Pike, his face a mask of disbelief that his plan had failed, barely had time to draw his pistol before Nantan was on him. The two men crashed together in a tangle of limbs. It was not a fight. It was a collision. Nantan, driven by a righteous fury, wrested the gun from Pike's hand and threw it aside. He slammed Pike to the ground, his hands closing around the bigger man's throat. "You would dig up my ancestors," Nantan growled, his voice a low, terrible sound. "You would turn their sacred ground into a grave for my people." Pike's face turned purple, his eyes bulging with terror. He clawed at Nantan's hands, his arrogance and power stripped away, leaving only a terrified, gasping animal. Nantan could feel the life pulsing beneath his fingers, could feel the fragile bones of the man's throat. A single, violent twist was all it would take. Vengeance was his for the taking. But as he looked down at the pathetic, squirming man, he saw not a solution, but a continuation of the cycle of violence. He saw Naichi's rage. He saw the fire in the eyes of Cutter. To kill Pike would be to become like them. He loosened his grip. He would not kill him. He would not give him the escape of a quick death. He would force him to face the justice of the world he had tried so hard to corrupt. Nantan chose mercy, not for Pike's sake, but for his own. He chose to remain a leader, not just a killer. At that moment, from the corner of his eye, Nantan saw a movement. Sheriff Cutter, who had been hiding behind a rock, was raising his rifle, taking careful aim at Nantan's exposed back. But Cutter had forgotten about Marisol. With Jonah safe for the moment, she had picked up the rifle of a fallen gunman. She was not a fighter, but she was a protector. With a cry of rage, she ran at Cutter, not firing the gun, but swinging it like a club. The heavy wooden stock connected with the side of Cutter's head with a sickening crack. The sheriff crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The fight was over. The sudden silence was as shocking as the noise had been. Pike's remaining men, seeing their leaders defeated and Nantan's warriors emerging from the shadows, threw down their weapons in surrender. One of them, a young man with fear-widened eyes, began to babble, the words tumbling out of him in a desperate, pathetic rush. It was him. It was Pike. He paid us all. There were contracts, money for the fake raids. For the land, he told us to clear the graves. Said the railroad would pay a bonus if the land was empty. It was all him. The confession, raw and unfiltered, hung in the air. A final, definitive end to all the lies. And then, the earth began to tremble. A low, deep rumble came from up the canyon. A sound that was not thunder. It was the sound of moving water. The heavy, unseasonable rain in the high country had finally gathered its strength. A wall of brown, churning water, thick with mud and debris, swept around the bend in the arroyo. A flash flood. The primal terror of the flood erased everything else. Alliances and enmities vanished, replaced by the universal instinct to survive. Nantan grabbed the dazed and whimpering Pike by the collar, dragging him toward higher ground. Marisol and one of Nantan's warriors scrambled to move Jonah. Everyone, friend and foe, was clawing their way up the muddy banks, fighting against the sucking pull of the rising water. Just as the sun broke over the canyon rim, bathing the scene in a clean, new light, the flood receded as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a world scoured and transformed. And standing on the rim, drawn by the sound of the flood and the gunfire, was the federal marshal and a posse of stunned townsmen. They looked down into the arroyo at the scene of devastation, the wounded blacksmith, the unconscious sheriff, the cowering railroad man, and the small, determined group of people, Apache and white, who had survived the night. The truth, like the stubborn desert sun, had finally risen. The journey back to Dry Vale was a slow, surreal procession. It was not a victory parade, nor was it a march of prisoners, but something strangely in between. Federal Marshal Thompson, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the weariness of the frontier, led the way. Behind him, Crawford Pike and the remnants of his hired guns trudged through the mud, their hands bound, their arrogance washed away by the flood, leaving only a sullen, muddy residue of defeat. Sheriff Cutter, his head bandaged and his face a mask of dull disbelief, was among them, his badge already tucked away in the marshal's pocket. Nantan and his warriors did not enter the town. They escorted the procession to the edge of the settlement, a silent, watchful presence that was more imposing than any armed guard. Nantan's gaze met Evelyn's for a long moment. It was a look that acknowledged the shared ordeal, the cost, and the fragile victory. Then, as quietly as they had appeared, they melted back into the landscape of rock and cedar. The townspeople gathered on their porches and in the muddy street, their faces a mixture of confusion, fear, and dawning comprehension. They saw Jonah Hale, pale but resolute, being helped along by Marisol, his side heavily bandaged. They saw Evelyn Hart, her dress torn and mud-stained, her hands wrapped in clean white linen, her face smudged with dirt, but her eyes clear and steady. The contrast between the defeated villains and the battered but unbroken heroes told a story more powerful than any rumor. The silence of the crowd was a new kind of sound for Dry Vale. It was the sound of a town holding its breath, waiting for the truth. The trial, when it came, was as raw and elemental as the land itself. There was no courthouse, no jury box, no paneled walls to absorb the lies. A circuit judge named Elias Miller, a lean, hawk-nosed man who had seen too much to be easily impressed or fooled, set up his court on the wind-swept loading dock of the cooperative warehouse. He used an overturned barrel as his bench and the vast, indifferent sky as his ceiling. The entire town formed a semicircle in the muddy yard, their faces turned up to the porch, a congregation ready for a different kind of sermon. The first to testify was the young gunman who had confessed at the arroyo. In the clear light of day, his fear was just as potent. He spoke in a rush, the words tumbling over one another as he detailed Pike's entire scheme: the contracts, the staged raids, the plan to use the dynamite to start a full-blown war, and the cold-blooded order to clear the Apache burial grounds to make way for the railroad. Then Judge Miller called for Evelyn Hart. She walked to the edge of the dock, her bandaged hands resting on the railing. The crowd stirred, a low murmur passing through them. This was the woman they had scorned, the subject of the filthy flyers. But as she began to speak, her voice was not that of a shamed woman. It was calm, precise, and devoid of malice. She told of the attack on the wagon train, of the cavalry boots she had seen. She held up the Henry rifle casing, its brass catching the morning sun. She described the camp at the Bluestone Hills and the piece of burlap with the railroad's insignia. She did not speak of her fear or her own suffering. She simply laid out the facts, one by one, like a teacher writing a lesson on a slate. The truth in her telling was not an accusation. It was an irrefutable sum. Jonah Hale, seated on a crate with Marisol beside him, spoke next. His voice was weak from his wound, but his words were heavy as iron. He told of the pay voucher Pike had burned, of the dying confession of the man Pike had left for dead. As he spoke, men in the crowd looked at the ground, their face tight with shame. They were the ones who had believed the lies, who had been so ready to form a posse for Pike's gold. Judge Miller then called forward Mr. Peters, the rancher whose sabotaged pump had been the spark for the latest round of fear. Peters shuffled his feet, his hat clutched in his hands. I reckon I was mistaken," he mumbled. "The tracks, they look like what Mr. Pike told me they'd look like. I never saw no Apache myself. I just believed him. His confession was a quiet echo of the entire town's failing." The judge turned his piercing gaze to the front of the crowd, where Reverend Briggs stood, his face a mask of pious indignation. "Reverend," Miller said, his voice cutting through the wind, "you were very vocal in your support of Mr. Pike's security measures. I understand your church received a rather generous donation from the Transcontinental Rail Company for the protection of civil order. Would you care to comment on that?" Briggs sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. "It was a charitable gift. To protect this flock from the forces of chaos and heathenism, I acted in good faith." Your faith, Reverend, seems to have a very convenient relationship with Mr. Pike's finances, the judge said dryly. He did not accuse the Reverend of a crime, which was a far more damning judgment. He simply let the implication hang in the air, a poison that seeped into the foundation of Briggs's moral authority, leaving it to crumble on its own. The proceedings were swift after that. Judge Miller declared that Crawford Pike would be bound over and taken by Marshal Thompson to Santa Fe to face federal charges of conspiracy, incitement to riot, and attempted murder. Amos Cutter was stripped of his office, his badge tossed unceremoniously onto the judge's barrel, a dull piece of tin that no longer held any power. His deputies, stripped of their leader, simply melted into the crowd. Their brief authority vanished. Justice had been served, but an uneasy peace settled over the yard. The source of the poison had been removed, but the sickness remained. The town had been set against the people of the mountains, and the fear and hatred, once sown, would not die easily. It was then that the town's mayor, a harried-looking man who ran the general store, approached the loading dock. He looked out at the silent crowd, then turned his gaze toward the bluestone hills. He cleared his throat. "Judge Miller," he began, "we, the people of Dry Vale, would like to make a treaty." An hour later, a small delegation from the town, led by the mayor and accompanied by Evelyn and Jonah, rode to the edge of the arroyo. Nantan was waiting for them, alone. He stood not as a defeated enemy or a triumphant conqueror, but as a leader, his presence as solid and enduring as the land itself. The mayor was nervous, but he spoke plainly. He offered a formal agreement, to be filed with the territorial authorities. The town of Dry Vale would recognize the Apache burial grounds as sacred and inviolable. They would not be surveyed, mined, or crossed by the railroad. In exchange, he asked that Nantan's people not interfere with the railroad's construction, as long as it stayed to the agreed-upon route. Nantan listened without expression. When the mayor had finished, he gave a single, slow nod. "We have never been the aggressors," he said, his voice calm and clear. "We have never asked for more than to be left with our memories and our dead. We will not harass your iron road, but you will not disturb our sacred ground. If you honor your words, we will honor ours." It was a simple agreement, born not of friendship, but of a new, hard-won respect. It was a bridge built across a chasm of blood and lies. In the days that followed, a quiet change came over Dry Vale. The air, which had been thick with tension, seemed to clear. Evelyn reopened her schoolhouse, and this time, the benches were full. People greeted her on the street, their eyes meeting hers with a shy but genuine admiration. The name they had used to mock her was never spoken again. She was Miss Hart, the woman who had faced down a tyrant with nothing but the truth. One afternoon, she was sitting on her porch, tending to her still healing hands, when she saw a group of children playing by the muddy ditch that ran along the main street. One of them had a stack of the old, filthy flyers that had been torn down from the walls. They were mud-stained and wrinkled, but the children saw none of the poison in the words. They saw only paper, with a solemn concentration. They began to fold the sheets into clumsy, lopsided boats, one by one. They set them afloat in the slow-moving water. Evelyn watched as the small fleet of lies drifted away, turning and bobbing in the current, the vicious headline, the crude fabrications. All of it was reduced to a child's game, its power to wound nullified, its venom diluted by the cleansing water. A slow, sad smile touched her lips. The wounds of the town, like the wounds on her hands, would take time to heal, but the healing had begun. The poison was finally being washed away. The seasons turned, and the raw wounds of Dry Vale began to scar over, healing into something tougher and more resilient than before. The wind still blew, and the sun was still a hammer, but the character of the town had shifted. The fear that had been its lifeblood was slowly being replaced by a cautious, hard-won decency. The most visible sign of this change was Evelyn Hart's schoolhouse. The small lamp she lit each evening was no longer a solitary point of defiance, but a welcoming beacon. In the mornings, she would see not only the children of the miners and merchants, but also small, shy figures with dark eyes and black hair, who had walked down from the blue stone hills. At first, the two groups of children sat on opposite sides of the room, a silent, miniature reflection of the chasm that had nearly torn their worlds apart. But children have little patience for the hardened prejudices of their elders. A shared game of marbles during a recess, a whispered joke, the simple act of helping a classmate sound out a difficult word, these were the small threads that began to weave a new tapestry. Evelyn watched as a miner's son showed one of Anaba's daughters how to form the letter B, and later saw the same girl teach the boy a string game of incredible complexity. They were learning more than reading and arithmetic. They were learning a new language, the language of a shared future. The sound of a hammer on steel rang out from the edge of town once more, but this time it came from a new smithy, larger than the old one. Jonah Hale, his side now healed into a long, puckered scar, worked the forge with a renewed purpose. His sadness had not vanished entirely, but it had been tempered by a quiet joy. He and Marisol had married in a simple ceremony on the porch of the boarding house, with the entire town, it seemed, in attendance. Their union was the foundation of the new Dry Veil, a partnership of strength and compassion that served as a bridge between the old wounds and the new hope. Their smithy became a neutral ground, a place where a rancher could get a wheel mended and one of Nantan's people could trade for a well-made knife. A place where conversation, however stilted at first, was beginning to flow. Evelyn and Nantan did not choose a life in either of their respective worlds. Instead, they chose to create their own. They did not leave the mountains, the land that held the memory of his people and the truth of her own transformation. They built a small, sturdy cabin of pine and stone in the hidden oasis, the place of healing, beside the warm, steaming waters of the hot spring. It was a place that belonged to neither the town nor the tribe, but to them, it was a sanctuary carved out of the wilderness, a testament to a love that was not about possession, but about shared space. Life was simple and deliberate. Nantan taught her the deep rhythms of the land, the language of the seasons, the names of the stars that wheeled in the vast, clear sky. Evelyn, in turn, read to him in the evenings by the firelight from her worn books, sharing the stories of kings and poets from a world away. He listened with a still, thoughtful intensity, finding the universal truths of courage, betrayal, and love in the unfamiliar cadence of the words. They were two different worlds, two different histories, finding a common center. One evening, as they sat by the edge of the pool, the steam rising around them in the cool, pine-scented air, Evelyn was tending to the last of the fading scars on her palms. They were pale, silvery lines now, a permanent reminder of her race against the fire. Nantan was watching her, his expression unreadable in the twilight. A slow smile touched his lips. He spoke the words softly, not as an accusation, but as a shared memory. His voice a low, gentle rumble. The Virin lady slipped right into his bath. Evelyn looked up, her heart giving a small, sharp jolt. For a moment, she felt the phantom sting of the town's scorn, the heat of their shame. But then she looked at Nantan's face, at the quiet humor in his eyes, and the sting vanished, replaced by a deep, abiding warmth. She smiled back, a genuine, unburdened smile. She finished the line for him, her voice as soft as his. The Apache chief caught more than just her hand. The ugly, sensational headline, the weapon that had been forged to destroy them, was rendered powerless in this sacred space. They had reclaimed it. They had taken the ugliest lie told about them and turned it into their own private truth. A joke, a story, a tender reminder of the moment their lives had irrevocably intertwined. He had caught her, not just her hand, but her life, her future, her heart. And she, in turn, had caught his. The poison had been transformed into a balm. Their love was not a fragile thing to be hidden away. It was strong enough to face down the ugliest parts of the world and find the beauty on the other side. It was a love built not on naive dreams, but on the solid ground of courage and responsibility. Far in the distance, a train whistle blew, a long, lonely cry that echoed through the canyons. It was no longer the sound of a threat, of an encroaching greed that would consume everything in its path. It was just a train now, a part of the vast and complicated landscape, its iron rails laid on a foundation of a hard-won, honest peace. It was a connection to the wider world, a world they were a part of, but not beholden to. From their high vantage point, the wind that swept up from the valley below carried a faint, new kind of music. It was the sound of children's voices, rising from the small schoolhouse in Dry Vale, singing a simple folk song. Mingled with that sound, carried on the same current of air, was another, deeper rhythm. It was the soft, steady beat of a single drum from the Apache camp in the hills. The two sounds, one of hopeful, youthful voices, the other of an ancient, enduring heart, did not clash. They intertwined, rising and falling together on the wind. Two different melodies finding a single, harmonious rhythm. It was the sound of two pulses, two lives, two worlds, finally beating as one. Thank you for listening to this story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to my channel Wild West Tales. Like the video. And support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can reach a wider audience.